Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the show. On this episode, I'm exploring a simple question. What is a sign? Now, at first glance, that sounds like a silly question, because a sign is just there to communicate something. They tell us where to go, what to do, what not to do, and occasionally what might happen if we ignore instructions. Stop, exit, push, pull, wet floor, mind the gap. And most of the time, we barely notice them. In fact, the best signs are the ones we probably don't remember at all, because they just quietly did their job. But if you stop and think about it for a moment, signs are fascinating. They're a form of communication. They shape behaviour. They encode authority, trust, and sometimes even power. They're also cultural artifacts. What makes sense in Tokyo might confuse someone in Tulsa. And in a world where we increasingly rely on navigation apps and digital prompts to tell us what to do, the humble physical sign raises some interesting questions. But signs can also be something else entirely. We talk about signs of danger, signs of change, even signs from the universe. In other words, a sign isn't just an object on a wall or a post beside a road. A sign is a form of communication, which begs several questions. Who decides what information we see? Why do we trust certain signs without question? And what happens when those signals are wrong, misleading, or even hacked? My guest today has spent his career thinking about exactly these dynamics. Jeffrey Ludlow is a signage designer who works on complex buildings and environments around the world, places like airports, offices, and cultural institutions, where getting people to the right place at the right time really matters. He's also the author of a wonderfully curious book called A Sign Is, which explores the history, meaning, and cultural significance of the signs that surround us every day. In our conversation, we explore how signs shape behaviour, why good signage is often invisible, how architecture and psychology intersect in wayfinding, and why something as simple as an arrow can carry centuries of history with it. We also talk about hacked traffic signs, casino design, airport navigation, and what signs reveal about trust, authority, and human behaviour. So if you've ever wondered why signs look the way they do, or why you sometimes get lost even when they're right in front of you, this is the episode for you. It's my discussion with Jeffrey Ludlow on what a sign is. Jeffrey, welcome to the Human Risk Podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I'm really, really excited to have you here because you've written an amazing book that just grabbed my attention on the bookshelf. We're going to come on to talk about that in a second. But before we do that, tell my listeners a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Sure. So I am a signage designer, a designer in general. I work a lot within the built environment. I was trained as a architect. So I come from a foundation of sort of architecture, but then moved over to sort of graphic design and communicating architecture, whatnot. And along the way, a very long time ago, I stumbled into doing sort of my first signage project. They needed an architect who understood sort of graphics and could manipulate the tools. And looking back, it's 20 years and now I've done so many different types of projects and et cetera. And signage has become the thing that has been like a reoccurring type of project that we do in the office that I have, which is Point of Reference Studio.
What is it about signage that appeals to you?
I think there's a couple things about sort of signs that are appealing. One, often in architecture, and the type of signage that we do primarily is for specific types of buildings and types of sort of architects that are known, or I don't want to call them just architects, but people who have peculiar buildings that are sometimes difficult to navigate. And so we have to, resolve things. So there's a lot of sort of the problem solving that I really do enjoy. How do we get a person from one space to another space? And how do we make that an efficient journey? But the other part is how to do it in a way that the building is communicating to you. Signage is the only way that it feels as if the building is talking to you. And so to be the voice and the designer of the voice of the building in a way is something that I really enjoy.
And so that in that first category, I guess you could look at it and say it's correcting I don't want to say design flaw because clearly those architects have designed it for
The
a
architects
reason.
don't love that.
But it's kind of, but by dint of the design, it's not navigable. And so you're
Yeah.
kind of correcting for that, going beautiful design or not, right? But there's a design
Hmm.
here, and
Yeah.
that doesn't lend itself to humans navigating it. So you're kind of, if I looked at it from a sort of, I guess, navigation purist's perspective, right?
Yeah.
You're correcting something that doesn't work naturally. So if you weren't there, it's an
Yeah.
intervention to solve a behavioral challenge.
Uh, Kind of in a way. I don't think of it necessarily as a mistake. I think more of it as a challenge in a way that, we as humans perceive space in a particular way. And so sometimes when you find architecture that's challenging, it's great because it kind of amplifies your senses. You start to look around, but also that when you're awestruck is that moment where you're like, wow, this airport's so amazing. And you're like, where's my gate? Right? And so you have to kind of balance the two. And so I never say necessarily that we're there to correct, but we're helped to sort of nudge people along to the right place. And we're not trying to redefine and create things, but trying to sort of make intuitive the flows as much as possible within those constraints. If that makes sense. Now, obviously, if there's a certain moment like, guys, we need a big arrow to turn left, we'll speak to the architect. And we also try to do it in a way that I often say to architects, if we don't do it now and we don't nip it in the bud now, you're not going to be here when the building's operational and it's life thereafter. So it's better we do it together, put it in your formal vocabulary, how you would like to do it, and let's resolve it now. Right. And so there's a lot of sort of working with the architects with it.
I love this. The one thing we haven't tackled, which points beautifully, let's get to the book as well
Yeah. Yeah.
as we do it. The book is called A Sign Is ...
Mhm.
So let's just ask the obvious question: what is a sign?
Ooh, a great question. A sign is a lot of different things. I mean, like, there's a formal definition which very ambiguous, like you see clouds in the sky and it says something. Could that be a sign? There's a lot of different ways to interpret that. But I think of when we think of sort of science, it's kind of information that's being imparted or given by someone to someone in a certain context. And I think there's a lot that in there is a real interesting power dynamic in terms of like, where am I? Who am I? What is that information and who's giving me that information? If I'm in a government building and it's telling me I can't bring in a firearm, that is a particular type of message. It has probably little text below that references a law or something, as opposed to another sign that is maybe more suggestive, right? The one that says the dog with the circle and it says, okay, my dog can't pee on your yard, but it's suggestive. It's, in a way, but in a way, what's interesting is like, it's trying to speak in the same language, right? But we as humans can understand the context and understand, okay, this is suggestive as opposed to this over here. Once I get in a courthouse in Texas or something of a sort where open carry, the nuance of American sort of firearm laws, et cetera, gets a little bit tricky, right?
And before we started recording, you said something that blew my mind because
Mhm.
it's super simple, which was everything is a sign is one
Mm,
way to look at the world. Talk a little bit about that because it
sure.
sort of it sounds like a ridiculous statement,
Yeah.
and yet you've kind of pointed at some of the reasons why that's really insightful.
Yeah. I mean, I was thinking a way, everything is a sign because so much of that language so ubiquitous. It's so everywhere. And it's the way we sort of think about a latch on a door on an airplane has arrows. That arrow has a history, one from first the armament, but now it's on a door. No one ever thought that that would be the arrow that they were shooting the longbows over the French would become a symbol that now has on a flying machine that somehow has a bathroom that requires a circular latch that I need indications for. So in a way, there's so much of that language is everywhere and all around us in sort of the built environment. Fire code, how do we get out of signs? Also type of sort of signs that tell us what are the rules and governance of a public space, a private space, what you can do, what you can't do. If you go to a public pool, there's signs are literally everywhere, right? And even more so, like I was having a conversation with someone. I was taking one of these new fancy kind of electric Ubers, and the cab driver was telling me, how in near future there will be no drivers, it'll be automatic cars. And it made me begin to think, what's going to happen to all the road signage? Will we ever need it again? Like what's and so there's a lot of, we're like in an interesting moment also sign wise where technology may replace a lot of that. How do we then navigate? And I think it's also something we as humans used to be better at. They used to say Eskimos can look at the snow at a certain time of the year and gauge, and know where north is. And we no longer can do that. We can barely navigate without an iPhone. So anyway.
It's kind of interesting because in a way, you could start with a benevolent thing saying signs are
Mhm.
helpful. On the other hand, it does point towards manipulation. We can't think
Sure.
for ourselves. We need to be told what to do. So there's something
Mhm.
fascinating there about control, coercion, being helpful. Where's the balance there? And my sense,
Sure.
it's not an easy topic to deliver. So as you're talking about these things, you get into the humble street sign or
Yeah.
instruction brings up a whole load of social, political dynamics.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, there's a lot of it and I think of it like, in a way, as the author and designer of signage systems within buildings, I tend to think like we're nudging people. I don't tend to think we're necessarily coercing them. However, I do also know there are other types of signs, and especially when I've worked on many projects, whether they be in the United States that are cultural or academic that have donor signs. And then you start to, really have to sort of put up a name in a room or a place or a plaza or anything of the sort. And you start to sort of think like, okay, who donated this money? What is the Sachs family? Who is this fat Sachs family? You know what I mean? Like it gets down a very tricky road. And so there's signs that are nudging and trying to get you to places, but there's also signs that are representative of power systems, especially when you get to donor signers or anything like that.
And I imagine you're based on the book and the conversations we've had, and just the sort of
Mhm.
person you seem to be. I imagine you're wandering around and you are constantly looking at what's happening around you and sort of
Oh,
alive
yeah.
to I guess the signs that are there, but also the signs that aren't and possibly should be.
Yeah, a lot of the times, to the chagrin of my family, whenever we go on holiday, they're like, "There's dad again," stopping us to take a picture of XYZ. It's like, I don't have enough ferry boat signs. You know? I mean, I look at it in a way out of curiosity, not only because of the lack of signage, but also to see how other people do it. It's very cultural how we navigate space and how we name things. I often give this example that in Japan, the way they number houses on the street is when the house appeared on the street. So one is not next to two. It's not evens and odds. It could be one, two, it's at the very end, three, four, five, six, seven, eight, and in a way, they're not thinking evens, and even when I travel, let's say to the Middle East, to sort of Dubai or something like that, where we have projects there, a lot of times they don't use street names. They're actually like they use the building name and what is in that building. So I'm like, I'm going to whatever, the Burj Khalifa to the Starbucks. And that they know. But if I give them the street address, they'll be like, what's that? So there's a lot of cultural things when I'm kind of sort of stopping my family in the middle of vacation to take a picture. It's often to kind of remember that there's a different way to do this in a different culture.
Are you just
Sure.
spotting things that are exceptional or unusual, or are you reading? I mean, because I guess
Mm,
if you genuinely were to stop at every single sign and take a good look at it, right, and
yeah.
that would be sensory overload just because of the
Oh, yeah,
volume of
for
it. It's
sure.
one of the things that comes out in the book is there are way more of these things than we might realize. Because I
Mhm.
guess a lot of them we either don't, it's not speaking to us, or we think we either can or think we can ignore it. So I guess to a certain extent, there's a filter going on in your head, because otherwise ironically, you'd never get anywhere, right? Because you spend your
Yeah.
whole time looking at
Yeah,
it.
yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, I often kind of sort of think about it. There's certain signs that I just don't take pictures of. I'm not interested in something if somebody misspells something. And especially because we live in a world where, there's so many people operating in English as a second language. So that's not really interesting for me. But there's also, I take pictures, like how nuanced things are represented, like, oh, look at that. Look, like when I go to the Middle East and I see the men and women bathroom icons, and I realize, oh, okay, the skirts are lower on the woman's bathroom. Or I look at other things. Sometimes it's for design, sometimes it's for messaging, sometimes it's context. It's like, look how out of place this is, like why would somebody put this in the middle of the rotunda? Like there's so many instances. It's so like it's for a lot of different things, but I'm always looking for anomalies. Like I don't need another stop sign. I got it.
Right.
You know what I mean? But if I find the original yellow stop sign, then I'm like, oh, okay, that's a weird one. So I'm always looking for the exception in those things.
And I love the idea of not being interested in spelling mistakes, or I guess what we call typos in the digital world.
Yeah.
Because it's always struck me that if a purpose of a sign is to communicate, if it achieves that objective in spite of not being perfect,
Oh, yeah.
then it's kind of done what it needs to do. And I've had argument would be too strong a word, but sort of discussions with people on LinkedIn who are kind of writers and proofreaders, and they get really exercised about such this. And I kind of look at it and think, if it does its job, it sort of doesn't matter. And actually, sometimes, of course, people play with that a little
Yeah.
bit and use that. But I love what you're talking about there, because you're going to the functionality of saying, is it doing what it's supposed to be doing?
Hmm.
And therefore, presumably, your view would be providing it achieves the objective. That's why your focus is interested in it. Ideally, of course, you get these things right,
Yeah.
but it probably doesn't matter. And if a
Yeah.
sign will serve its purpose by people reacting to it in the intended way.
Yeah. And I think that also kind of depends on context. Look, if we're doing a signage system in the US or in England or primarily English speaking, yes, spelling counts, typos count. But if I'm looking at signage, like I remember I lived in China for 7 years and there was a signage company that we worked with. And on the doors of their company, it was an old like kindergarten, a communist kindergarten that they repurposed for their offices. And they had the kind that was in Chinese that said essentially close the door to keep the heat in. But the way it was written in English, it was like close the door to keep the animal heat in. And I was like, okay, that's funny, but no one sees the humor in it here because no one speaks English. And they're only doing it because they assume somehow the international standard for a secondary language should be the English. So in a way, like I'm always like, okay, I could laugh at that, but I could also say like, okay, there is something that is represented here as English as the second dominant language, even in the middle of Beijing for this signage company that they know that right or wrong, it has to be there. Right. So there's a lot of that goes into it. Yeah.
Right. And so presumably the photos gallery on your phone is just rammed full of few photos of the family. Obviously, they belong in there. Presumably large, if we were
Yeah.
to sort of analyze your phone storage, it would be, I'm guessing, largely signs, which leads you to
Yeah.
the book. And let's talk a little bit about that.
Sure.
Because my sense was you've got a load of things that I guess you want to share with people and thoughts and
Yeah.
inspirations. And so it's a collection of essays of things that have grabbed your attention. What prompted you to write the book, and how did you go about deciding what was going to go in it?
Like many things, this was a little bit of a pandemic baby in the sense I was walking around during the pandemic, walking my dog. And, I was like, God, there's so many signs when you don't count the people, when you just like walk around the city. And I started sort of just to think about that. And I started to just do these kind of Instagram reels, just to sort of like small little stories. Like I would call it sort of a short sprints, narrative sprints about individual signs and things like that. And then once I kind of built up enough, I was like, this could be a book. And so then I started thinking, okay, I'm not focusing on a singular story, but it's these individual essays about different sign types. And so then I went down the list and I said, what would I want to know about? Because I think that's always I mean, for me, I personally think the most important person to please is kind of yourself when you're kind of writing these things and like, what would be interesting to me? And so I knew that within the world of sort of books about science, there's two types. One is the how-to wayfind, and the second one is like the collection of great projects, from different studios and projects, etc. And I said, yeah, but there's not enough really dedicated one to where these signs came from, what do they mean, and where are they going? And so a lot of that came down of just sort of looking around these kind of ubiquitous elements that we see that everyone can see in their everyday space and start to research and write about them and form opinions. And sometimes those opinions are like a little bit odd or peculiar. Why is this person dedicating so much headspace in the written word to fire signage? But there was a lot to unpack there. And I think part of that was also like, and that's why every topic, every essay is a little bit nuanced and different. But let's talk about fire, because I think this is one that is a really interesting one, because when you look around a hotel, probably your office, anywhere that's not residential and sort of private, it's littered with all these signs to try to get you out. Right. And I was like, where did these come from? And when you look at the history of sort of fires, it's something that it's code related, but we seem to forget. And every 10 to 20 years, there's a major disaster where through death, essentially, we learn these lessons of why, there's latches. And so in a way, what I in that chapter did was kind of chronicle the sort of the worst disasters that led to signage and of course other things in the code and push bars on doors and all these other things, elements like kind of fire alarms, etc., that came with it. But I think what's interesting is that fire is a living element that is changing as we are changing the materials we're building with, right? And so in a way, what was fire code a long time ago and what is today, it's also evolving. And so there's the need for different types of signs, right? And so there's a lot of that goes into it. And it becomes, and sometimes you'll probably see it. Have you ever seen like the red triangle on a window on a skyscraper? That's, where the firefighters need to know to go up there. But if you don't know what that is, just a random red triangle, but it's a sign, right?
The way you've just talked about there as well, it's this sort of thing. It's a, kind of fire is to use my language, a kind of compliance requirement, right? We need to tell people how to get to the building if this happens.
Yeah.
And so it sort of sits there in the background. And what I loved is you geeked out on this and take that as a compliment, right? Is you kind of just went, I don't know where this is coming from. Let's dive in. And so what I loved was you made the history accessible, right? It's the sort of thing where I read it and was like, I couldn't be bothered to go to that level of detail, but you have, and you've pulled it up and digested it. And so there was something wonderful there about a little bit of a personal quest to find out more.
Yeah.
And I guess if I looked at the whole thing, I'd be going sort of driven by curiosity.
Mm.
Is that a fair description?
It's a fair description, because a lot of the times it felt writing this book was a little bit like writing. Each essay was started off as an unsolved mystery, in a way that you're like, why does this thing exist? Why does it look the way it looks? Where are we going with this? Like one of my favorite chapters is also the pharmacies, and that was just like walking around in Madrid in Europe here, and you see these green crosses and, they're throbbing to the beat of a rave song. And you're like, why is this? Where did this come from? And so what's interesting is that some of these signs are not just as individual objects, they have sort of history, but they're also connected to the pharmacies and the history of sort of pharmacies and the peculiar history that pharmacists previously had as really a showman, as chemistry showman, and before the strobing sort of like LED green cross, there used to have these like vases that they would mix different chemicals to show you wonderful and spectacular they were, and that you couldn't find in them because they made colors pretty, essentially in a vase, which is very bizarre. But in a way, that's where pharmacy is like, let me sell you this. And this is also during sort of the mid 1800s, etc. So there's a lot of that sort of came from that, that is tied to these things. And so when you see that, you're like, oh, these pharmacists are holding on to dear life, even though they probably got corporate jobs and they're in the doldrum. Give them their one little sign that they can program like there is no tomorrow,
I absolutely loved it because you started to ask questions that once you'd asked it made perfect. I was like, oh, that is interesting. And I'd never stopped to think about it. And actually, I wanted to thank you because I ended up going into the pharmacy museum in Heidelberg in Germany because of that chapter in the book. Because ordinarily I would have gone, this is going to be a bit dull. And it was you that prompted me to go, there may be more to this than you might think. Because I was expecting bottles of potion, the sort of usual things you would expect. And I was less interested in that. I was more interested in the theatre that underpinned this. This is why I think the book is great, is it's taking a subject, and yes, it does explore what the sign's there for, what do they do, but it opens up your eyes to a much broader range of topics. So I wanted to say thank you for that. I think that's such a great example of it. And just to sort of give us an alternative perspective, one of the other chapters I loved was you talk about those signs that they use to direct traffic, and in particular, how someone those. Tell us about that, because I'd never heard this before, and I was just like, whoa, like it's a clever protest, but really interesting analysis of the sign and what function it serves as well.
Yeah, it's kind of really interesting because, I think this is also, I love this chapter because one, it talks about something we know, and it's these kind of sort of LED signs that you see on sort of construction that redirect traffic, that tell you of sort of oncoming traffic, etc. But I think what we don't really realize about those signs is that they were, the technology was only readily available like 15, 17 years ago when it came about and became, affordable for construction companies to buy that. And what's kind of really interesting is those signs came default from the factory with like, a password that was like basically 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Right. And so the construction company that would then sort of use them, never bothered to change the code on many of these. And so the moment the first hack that I kind of chronicled was at MIT. And MIT has a long history of sort of pranks and hacks that they do every spring. But for 1 year, they found one of these signs, put it out there, hacked into it, and changed the message of it, And they not only did this, but they also shared this to Boing Boing. I don't know if you remember this website from sort of 20 years ago. And this began disseminated everywhere. And suddenly across the US and many other places, you suddenly saw alternate messages, Panda on a rampage, like many kind of sort of funny things. And then you start getting into 2016, where the politics takes a little bit of a turn. The messages turn a little bit more, phobic, a little bit darker, a little bit more, biting. And then someone kind of comes along the way, and this is written in the article, and sort of then says, okay, that is a dynamic sign that's made out of LEDs, but what about these ones that are above the highway, these gantry signs, and hacks into that and then publishes that. And I think it's a funny thing when you think of these signs, because you see them so often, and you see them defaced, often, especially in the US and the country, do you see a stop sign that is defaced or shot through with a shotgun or something of the sort? And that's okay, a prank. But the moment you get to that gantry sign, that is then classified as terrorism, because that is no longer funny, haha. That is funny, serious, right? And part of it is, and oddly enough, the password for that was probably 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, to gantry sign, because it comes to fall from the factory. Nobody changes the password, blah, blah, blah. But I think what's funny about that is you begin to realize, especially in the context of roads and highways and distracted driving and all of this, how important the source of information is that is given to you. And who controls it is important, right? And so if the person controlling it, whether it be the construction company or whatever, the authorities that be, don't change the password, it is hackable, right? Then anybody can put anything up there, right? Black hat, white hat, whatever, any sort of actor can sort of come on the stage. And I think what is kind of interesting is, I mean, we now live in an age of disinformation, but that is a place you expect. If the highway sign says turn right, that you believe it intuitively, it feels official. It's on a sign, right? It has the framing of, officiality. And so I think there's a little bit of, it's a curious thing because like there's a moment where the funny prank is not so funny immediately. So it's a very peculiar chapter that deals with the nuance of messaging actors. What is that fine line of sort of signal interruptions and who's doing it, to what effect, right? But yeah, it's a fun chapter.
Yeah, because it just pointed to me to sort of, it's about trust really. It's control and trust and all these dynamics. But it struck me that there are certain signs that we are encouraged, forced to trust because of circumstance, and then there's others that have the opposite effect. And as I started to look at the landscape, and that's why I loved you covered this broad range of things. Is what is a sign, and hence the title, right? It can be loads of different things. Where do signs stop and other things? What is a sign versus an advertisement? And we can find extreme examples of things that sit neatly in the cap. But if you look at the Venn diagram, there's a massive overlap between those two things.
Oh yeah.
You got me thinking about, well, where does kind of the trust that we have to have in certain signs, at some point, we need to bring cynicism to it. And where's that balancing act and how should we go about it? And therefore, also the power that people that are putting these things up have.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of really funny. I remember hearing this story. There was this artist who saw a sign on a California highway, and I think this might have been chronicled in another podcast, but saw a sign on a highway. It was didn't have the right information. He bought a green vest. He went up there and changed it himself. And that sign stayed there for like many years. So someone realized that it wasn't an official sign. Right. And I think there's something kind of sort of to that signs, especially in that context of highways and ways that they are framed, seem official. But there's a lot of what signs do that nudge behavior for good and bad. And then you get to that layer where there's advertisements. Advertisements are all nothing but nudges. It's like go to, Burger King. It's right there. Why not? Here's a big picture of cheesy melted cheese on beef. So there's a lot that within the language of large formats. Right. And I think I want to say that specifically because obviously there's a lot of small formats in terms of digital advertisement. But in the large format sign, it's kind of curious that it's a similar vocabulary. It just looks a little bit different. There's more Photoshop. There's more things to it. It's more pictorial and less pictures, but the framing behind it is all the same. I think I wrote this in sort of the book, that JC Decaux, which is a French-based advertising company, I often relate them as to the world's largest landlord in 2 dimensions, because like how much space do they own globally between Europe, Asia, like in just billboards and for buses, airports, all of that. It's massive. And the amount of money they do and sort of like renting it out just for temporary messages of whatever it may be, advertisements or not, is it's a lot, but it's the same format. It is a sign.
And it struck me that as you were talking about space, I was laughing the other day because, there are signs that tell dogs they can't do certain things. Now, obviously, the dogs are not expected to read those signs.
Yes.
It's for the humans that are supposedly in control of those dogs to read those things. So what we're ultimately pointing towards when you talk about space is, of course, human headspace. And I'm intrigued into your views as to sort of, I guess, information overload. And we can think of that most obviously on our smaller digital screens. But if I go out there and it strikes me when you go to countries, North Korea would be a good example. There will be signs and communications there, but it'll be very different. Be far less. The sense of, how does one make a sign break through in a world that's overloaded? And you were talking about directions. I think in France, if this happens particularly, you go to a traffic junction and there will be signs telling you where the nearest petrol station, McDonald's, whatever, that is competing for your attention for the traffic lights and the sort of normal road signs. So it's an interesting world where unless we're living in North Korea, where we're overloaded in a different way. I probably don't have any listeners there, I'm guessing. But there's an interesting thing about having to compete back to the original start of the thought, was compete for headspace. We're trying to get people's attention in a world where there are loads of other things trying to grab that attention. And that presumably is a challenge for people designing signs.
Yeah, it is a challenge, but I also think in a way, like, one of the interesting thing about sort of signage and wayfinding is that, look, we don't come out of the womb reading signs and know what to do. It's a language that we learn. It's a way we learn to navigate. And so, like, when you were discussing the particulars of that sort of rotunda or that in France, there probably was a way that either by color or something else, you understand that. And I'm just sort of thinking, I'm not sure exactly how it is, but a different color backgrounds or framing or shapes mean certain things. So we know the stop sign is an octagon. When we see a triangle, depending on the side or how it's orientated, it's telling us to be cautious of something. When we see in the US, when we see a brown sign, we know that's talking about national parks, and so there's a way that there's a coding in a visual language that through time and use, especially, we all have to get our driver's license and we learn that language via there. But even in normal use, we began to understand, the sharp point of the arrow is what it's pointing to. Like, imagine, but this is the truth. I often sort of get around and said, if there was a moment after the pandemic that if the world ended and aliens came down and looked down and said, look at these guys, they got dots every meter and a half separated everywhere. What happened? And how would you explain to them the pandemic? They're like, they really love to grid things out. It's like, would be the takeaway from the alien. So I do think there's a way that when we talk about signage and wayfinding, we're talking about a learned behavior set that we as humans have. It modulates as we go from culture to culture. The road signs in France are probably very similar to what you have in the UK, but might be a little bit different, obviously, in the US, or if you're driving in other places, etc. So, yeah, I don't know if that answered the question.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, isn't it? Because you're right. It's a sort of set of learned conventions. And this is why I think what you've done with the book and the way you think about things is really interesting, because we kind of take it for granted. And you're right that even if you haven't done your driver's license, you will understand, okay, stop sign is kind of obvious because it's got the word written.
Yeah.
But there are lots of other signs that we can intuitively interpret, and that in fact, we're expected to interpret as pedestrians or cyclists that we may not have been trained on before. And maybe it does form part of our education at school, but nonetheless, we pick these things up. And so we've created these societal norms. And I hadn't really thought about this, but I love that idea of actually arrow. It's a convention that it means that way around, but there's no reason why it has to mean exactly that. It could mean something completely different.
Correct.
It could mean don't go that way. It's just that we've got used to it meaning do go that way. And so there are all these interesting things that we've picked up. And so there's a basis there, which I guess for you to be able to do what you do, you build off those conventions. And so advertising can break those conventions and do the opposite. I'm guessing to a large extent, there are constraints on you or things that you want to, maybe that's a bad way of looking at it. Or is it? Are these constraints or are these things that you can, is it positive or are you building off these things? Because you're right, there's a whole set of conventions there that are often, they're written down in law, But for the average person, we're not thinking in those terms. We're just sort of navigating based on what we've picked up over years.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think you kind of struck two kind of different veins there that I think are interesting. One, when you're talking about sort of navigation and sort of wayfinding and whatnot, like I always take the position that no news is good news, meaning that only time anybody remembers a signage and wayfinding project is when it didn't work and they got complaints, right? So that's number one. If you got the person to their gate, to their train, to their office, to, their home or whatever it may be, right? Then you're fine. You're doing a good job, right? The second is like when you start to talk about sort of advertisement. Yes, it's supposed to sort of shake you up because we also do branding and we also do things. So there are moments within that you want to sort of like, hey, look at me, and hey, draw their attention. However, we also know that as humans, like attention is not limitless. Like I'm not lost in looking at a Google advertisement for hours. It's not that great. Like I'm just not bewildered by this because it's media. We're subsumed to it. We're seeing it on our phone, our devices, on screens and everything. And so it just washes over. It's like that moment in the Minority Report, where there's just screens and screens and screens on top of screens, right? And so I think in a way, like it's harder to compete in that space. It's harder to attract attention. And so there's kind of, and I'm kind of pointing to the irony. It's like no news is good news, but the other is like, if you somehow break through, you like, how did you break through? Was it by normal conventions? Because it's not like witty copy on a tagline is not going to like break through to everyone. Like there might be a couple things. And that's also sort of, that's a little bit sort of grim to think that nothing breaks through, but for whom, for what, we're such an atomized society that like what I might do may be interesting for me of a man of my age and background. But then for someone else who's from a different generation, younger, they'd be like, what's this, grandpa? So do you know what I'm saying? Like,
yeah, totally. But I was thinking about, no news is good news or success or whatever you want to phrase. That brings us to one of my other sort of topics that fascinates me is kind of, I would describe it as airport signage, but I guess you could include train stations and other things there. And
transportation.
I'm always struck by when it's done well, to your point, it serves its purpose.
Yeah.
And we don't even notice that. So if I take Schiphol Airport as a good example, others are available, of signage that is, the color spot are like noticeable. They give you just the right information at the right point in time. It's a national treasure because it's in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, which is kind of unusual for some. So I love this idea of you create something that serves a purpose that, and I guess it's like good service. It's kind of, you just don't notice it. It just happens and the experience is a good one and you are able to do what you need to do. And so I love that idea of it almost being, ironically, almost being invisible, right? It's not invisible in the moment, but it doesn't stick with us.
It doesn't stick with us, but I think the other thing that's kind of sort of like the way I think of signage as trying to be in sort of the hospitality and trying to be a good host. If you're being a good host, you're kind of there, you're providing, but you're also like in the way. You're not trying to be in front of every conversation. You're providing the platform for, a nice meal for people to have a conversation. And so I do think in a way signage kind of operates that way. So there is a little bit, not only is it somewhat invisible, but did it get me to a place with distinction, with a little bit of style, and I think in a way, Stipple is a really great example of that because it's a system and it's a system that exudes trust. And you look at that and you're like, oh, these Dutch got it down pat. I'm not going to get lost here. This is the land of logic and, Gouda, and I'm going to get to my gate. Right. And I say that because with a lot of respect for Holland and having worked there for a certain part of my life, there is a lot of that in there. Right. And so it's also part of that national sort of character, that within that, in the same way, Stipple in the UK, transport and the typeface and the type of signs and everything, it's now part of your national character, and so I do think there's a way that those signs, just like language and terminology, slowly through repetitive use, become a thing that you may not notice for a while, but then when you notice it, stop noticing it, and people are like, oh, this thing worked so well. you know? It's like I'm looking at a book that I recently purchased on Margaret Calvert, which I don't know if you know is, a treasure in the UK. Her design systems for all the signage systems that she's done for, the highway, etc. And so I do think there is a way that in due time, people kind of learn to appreciate it.
There are some famous people who have made their careers out of signs.
Yeah.
Is this an innate skill or is it a learned skill? Because it seems to me it brings together, if I look to the discipline, it brings together a whole host of different things.
Yeah.
You have to have an eye for something and be very human. So I wondered, is this a learned skill? In other words, is one naturally drawn to this because it requires a certain skill set that's difficult to learn?
I don't want to sell myself short and say it's not.
Well, I mean, it's a ridiculously big question, but I'm just intrigued with the balance of.
Yeah, I would say one thing's kind of curious with anybody who's working within this sort of sector, there is no sort of school that teaches it. It kind of generally sort of
that would be a much better way of asking the question. Thank you.
Yeah, it accrues people generally from three or four different sort of fields, usually sort of architects, interior designers, industrial designers, and graphic designers, and they kind of all congregate there. Sometimes there's people who talk about this as environmental graphic design, and then they also begin to lump in, people who do work on the graphic design for museums and other things and create environments through the use of sort of graphic design. But it is a field that you kind of have to innately understand space and how it's used. And I say that because not every building is the same. Like I remember the first building I worked on was a casino, and the signage there was hyperly thematic and hyperly sparse. Because what does a casino not want you to do? They don't want you to leave, right? So they want you to be intuitively lost, And ironically, in transportation projects, they don't want you anxious. They want you, getting, to your destination as quickly as possible, giving you more information. On the flip side, cultural institutions, museums are exactly like the casino. They want very little signs. They want you lost. Well, lost may not be, but they want you experiencing the art. They don't want you to be navigated and nudged through the space. They want you to find it on your own. Right. And so I do think there's a way that one of the most important things, it's not the graphic design. Yes, there's a little technicality, how you build these things, how you detail these things, the scale and size of those things. But those things are all you can learn. There's books to learn those, right? One of those wayfinding books that I referenced earlier. But I think the sensibility, and I think where the art really comes into play, and it's not the science, is really understanding when to sign and how to sign and at what volume, right? And I think that's the important thing. The same way you wouldn't, overly sign in a museum, like there, over there, Picasso, like you would in an airport, because no one's anxious about seeing a painting or a piece of art, but they are anxious. You're managing expectations and anxiousness, in an airport in those moments, right? So there is a certain psychology to that of how many signs, where to place it. And that's kind of sort of the real art, because then you get to mark the experience level.
Love that casino thing, because it's kind of like if they could get away with no signs whatsoever, that would be, certainly you wouldn't want people pointing people to the exit, but you have given most casinos, I'm thinking Vegas here in particular, most casinos are hotels. So you need to help people get to their rooms at some level. Otherwise they'll get annoyed.
Yeah. But that's like that number and that number over there,
Right. You need to let people go to the bathroom to sustain their gambling thing. But you're right. Signs pointing to the exit are probably, I guess they're helpful to hotel resort guests, but less so. So that's a really interesting
never a clock or sunlight or something that tells you how long time has passed.
And actually, as you're sort of talking, I'm shifting that thinking to transport. There are lots of particularly older systems like the London Underground, People make a great thing about, here's a hack, right? Here's a way that you can get quickly from this line to that line. Don't follow the signs, right? Because they want to manage massive flows of people. They want to send the vast majority of people. But if you ignore that, right, you go out this exit. This is a much quicker way to do it. It struck me that often the objectives of the system might have are not necessarily in the interest of the individual participant in the system. It might help overall flow or the business, but you don't want individuals to have the most efficient route. And so when I look at it, often there's an implicit presumption when I read a sign that it is going to send me the most beneficial route. But we know from all the hacks, and we all have our own sort of shortcuts that are not the official route, which I guess has to be not the official route, because if everybody knew that, it wouldn't always provide the best. So there's this interesting tension between what the system wants and what we might want as individuals.
Yeah, no, 100%. I think there's something like, I tend to sort of think like IKEA. There's the path that they want you normally to take, and there's the sort of shortcuts that you could take in between to cut through spaces. And if they don't stop you necessarily, right? But I also, look, wayfinding, it's not a science where everyone's going to get to their destination. And I often sort of say that, and it seems like, ooh, that's a bold statement. Like, there's a guy who works on wayfinding and says, like, it's not for everyone. And I think also partly that is to do with, like, we as humans have different levels of spatial understanding and comprehension. Like in my family, I'm the map guy. My wife is not. She was like, me and my son are like, how do you not remember this neighborhood? And spatially, like if you put me on a path, I will return the same way back. And intuitively in my head, I can't tell you how I process that. I saw a banana peel on the floor. I followed it, and I connect all these things. Do you see what I'm saying? We as humans are not all equal on that level, right? And so my job to navigate people a lot of the times is dealing with the most amount of people, the average person who does not have a level of spatial comprehension and understanding, and at times through very difficult buildings. I'll tell you two, for example. I worked on CCTV on Beijing, that kind of angular tilted Mobius building, and also worked on sort of the Apple headquarters, which is the cylinder, on there. And I have the title, self-proclaimed and nobody cares title of the person, expert of circles, how to navigate people around, things, right? And I do think part of the reason that it's difficult is that in those are challenging spaces. 2 towers, both with a floor 23. How do you know which tower you go into? What if you get on the wrong tower? You have to look across and like, oh, I'm supposed to be over there, right? And also the same thing with the Apple headquarters. No reserved parking in the basement. So every day you come in, you park your car, and you're in a different part of this big circle. You come up and you may be traveling, a quarter of a mile to your office. That's what's literally right next to your elevator, and you didn't know, And so there's many things like that you have to contend with. And what you're contending with is not for the person who's smart, that knows the shortcut. It's the person who doesn't, right? And at times, especially on these large transportation, we as humans are only dumber navigating in space while we go in groups, right? There's a reason why the tour group has a flag. Right. And so I do think there's a lot of that happens. And so when you throw cell phones and everything else and people not knowing, many people don't know how to read a map these days. Orienteering is a thing of the past, My son will look at a map and he'll be like, why doesn't it turn with me?
So that's interesting. So you said they won't get to their destination. So implicitly, the person you're never going to be able to help, right? The opposite end of the spectrum.
And at times, the higher the risk in let's say in an airport, you're planning with redundancies. That's why then it's like multiple messages at different places. If you
so this is the equivalent of
we're going to get it there.
It's almost the equivalent of we're going to mislead you about boarding time because we need to cater for the lazy people, the people who cut it fine. So we're going to tell you the plane's boarding, even though it isn't. Right. And then it gets worse because people are compensating for that, knowing that there's a margin of error in there. So there's a little bit of a game here, I guess. And it's interesting because I get if you were catering for the most, let's be extreme here, the most stupid person, or the person who's capable of thinking for themselves. Yeah, you're right. That's better. Yeah. Then you would the level of signage that you would put there, I guess you could tolerate by annoying the really smart, but there comes a time where it would impinge on the average person's ability, be too much signage. So you're kind of catering, I guess, for the lowest common denominator. You're trying to mitigate risk, but it's not, we guarantee 100% of people will get there, partly because they have agency in the situation, but also because that's not possible. So in other words, signs are never going to get you zero accident. They're not going to lead to every single person finding the path correctly. That's built into, it has to be that way.
It has to be, but it's also what you said is we're trying to get the most amount of people to the correct destination almost the most amount of times, right? And so that's why it's like, is every signage system perfect? Absolutely not. But I don't know, you might be blind as a bat. You can't see, like there's so many variables as receptors of informations, of our vision, of our comprehension, of our spatial organization. Have I been to this place before? Have I been to the airport ever? That's a whole, sequence of spaces and a ritual that if you've never been, you'll be like, what is this? Like, so there's a lot that goes into those, the processing of that. Right. And so I think in a way, that's why I tend to be very dubious of thinking of it as a science, but really a little bit more like an art in the sense there is a certain sophistication that you need to know. You need to know the language. Are we communicating in the right language visually and through text? Are you comprehending it? Can you see it? Is it working? But also, where are those decision points? Suddenly you encounter in your path an escalator and you're like, what's upstairs? And if I don't tell you what's up and you decide to take the bait and you go up and you're like, oh, it's just a closet. And you're like, well, I guess I should have told you downstairs. And then you're like, oh, it's a one-way escalator. How do I get down now? Right? So there's a lot. Yeah.
I love this because I was just thinking the most annoying thing ever, well, not the most, but one of the most annoying things ever is a sign that comes too late. It's useful information, but it's come after the junction. They kind of, because I remember the number of times it's sort of like, roadworks or something, and they inform you that the next exit is closed. And you go, well, if I'd known that back there, I would, now I might have missed it, but they did, it's almost like in that case, no sign might be better than a sign that's irritating. And so there's an interesting sort of dynamic there that says I guess location would be the physical equivalent of all of that stuff really matters.
And I think driving is a whole game changer. You walking in the way you can comprehend sign, and because when you get into higher speed situations, driving a car, there is a moment that over information is gonna make you a worse driver and more prone to an accident. And so there is a little bit, and this is where this goes back to the nuance of like, how much information can you handle and sustain at this moment, and even in sort of like signage in the inside of buildings, such as sort of airports, am I going to tell you all the times of every plane when you just arrive at the airport? Is that when you need it? Or am I going to break this up, get you to a certain section of the airport and only tell you just for that part? And if we've got you to that wrongly to that part, how do you get to the other part? Do you see what I'm saying? Like there is a moment that you need to sort of break down information, but also make sure that it's sequenced in a way that you can, I often sort of say this is that giving information has to be simple in a way that you can verbally tell someone else those directions. Right?
I love that.
Because that goes down to how do you start to name things, And I often, there's a lot of different ways to break this down. There's a latch method. I don't know if you know this: location, I forget, area, time. There's all these different ways to break down information. But one of the ways
I love the fact that it's potentially failed because you can't remember the constituents.
Oh, 100%. But also we as people, like in a way, I sort of think like if let's say I'm working on an office building and they have a meeting room and they decided to name the meeting room base, the building name, the floor, the part of the building, and the number of the office. I now may have, like a complicated set of, numbers and letters that I'm now like trying to remember, like, where are we? We're on B11 27 805 room lunar. We're like, do you know what I mean? Like, and that also goes down to a lot when we think about that problem of sort of how to navigate people to places. It's like the first part is like, what do you call things? Because nobody wants to be given a Wi-Fi password of, directions to get to a place.
Love that. Jeffrey, it has been such a pleasure. You are such an interesting person doing such an interesting thing. I could keep talking to you forever, but time is against us. So let's do the basic. If people want to, firstly, let's start with remind us what the book is called. I'm supposed to say where people can find it, but that's kind of obvious. Tell me what the book is called and then how they can get hold of you and learn more about what you do.
Yeah. So the book is called A Sign Is ... It's available on Amazon and basically anywhere you can buy sort of books. I have an office called Point of Reference Studio, which we work on sort of wayfinding, signage, and sort of branding for public places and place branding, etc. And we're based in Madrid, but we work everywhere. The US, Asia, sometimes the UK, sometimes not. But yeah.
Amazing. Well, beautifully signposted. And of course, one of the things that I can't remember if you do it in the book, but I've certainly seen you talk about this. And this is so obvious from the way you talk about this stuff. There is clearly a lot more material out there. So a sign is too, surely is only a matter of time. And I want to encourage you to get that out there because like you've really got me thinking about something that I love this idea of if it works, it's kind of that you forget it's invisible to us.
Yeah.
And I love this idea of you've got curiosity, like, why is it that way? The childlike curiosity is infectious. So I want to publicly encourage you to write that second book. I recognize it may not come immediately, but please, please do that because the first one was a fabulous read.
I have everything that didn't fall in the first book. There was a couple topics that didn't fall in and new ones that are sort of coming up. I think it's more or less in the works. There's another book before that we want to put out, which is a little bit of less about signage, but like what signs could be and how they should be made of, which we might be sort of working on, which is kind of like, why can't you make signs out of this? Like we've always been limited by steel, wood, and these other things, but like we did recently a sign, and we're still working through an Italian manufacturer that it's essentially made like a puffy coat. It's made out of textile. Yeah. And part of that, it's also just because why not? Why can't we can make signs out of a bunch of different things. And as they could be more interesting, digital, analog, etc.
I love that idea. When that book comes out, because I'm going to be positive about this, and not say as and when, but when that book comes out, if you want to come back on the show to talk about it, I'd be delighted to have you back on.
Absolutely.
But listen, thank you so much for piquing my curiosity. Being a super interesting writer, but for right now, being an incredibly interesting guest on the show. Thank you so much.
No, thank you. Thank you for letting me nerd out about this.
So that's it for this episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to you for listening, and of course, to Jeffrey for appearing. To find out more about Jeffrey, the work that he does, and his fabulous book, A Sign Is, have a look in the show notes. There are links to all those there. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, where have you been? But thank you so much for joining me. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. To discover episodes of the show that you might have missed, and there are over 360 of them now, visit the show's website, which is humanriskpodcast.com. I will be back very soon with another episode of the show, but in the meantime, stay safe Have a look at the signs around you. You might discover there are more of them than you thought, and you might find that they pose some interesting questions if you start to think about what they're there to do and how they're doing it. If you like signs and are interested in it, then do also visit the Compliance in the Wild channel on LinkedIn. You can get there by going to complianceinthewild.com. But thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you very soon for another episode of the show.